Good viewer. Watch Xirtus. Watch Xirtus.
Hey kids, how's it going, boys and girls? Have you ever downloaded a song or a video or maybe some kind of a file at some point? Well, chances are you might have used a thing called peer-to-peer. Peer-to-peer is this distributed application architecture that was the only way that you could have possibly been able to get distribution of a file to many, many people. You might have had to use one monolithic machine to send 1,000 files everywhere else, or you could share the files with each other. This idea is actually still being used today. If you use BitTorrent, for instance, we're all using a peer-to-peer kind of network. And this is in major part inspired by a lot of the philosophical work of Michel Bauwens, one of the best Belgians in the world. Just want to say thanks for all you've done for us as a people, as a civilization. Thank you so much. How are you doing today?
I'm pretty good. So I'm here in Bangkok. I usually live in Chiang Mai in the north of Thailand, but for the moment I'm staying in Bangkok, which is a hectic kind of city, and strangely enough, colder than Europe right now.
Hmm. It is hot here. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's 28, and I my son is in Louvain in Belgium, and it was like 36.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's like
It's
the Charlie
crazy.
Sheen movie Arrival. They're
Yeah.
terraforming our world for the reptiles, yeah. But so what are you doing with your life right now? And maybe give us a little first off, give us a little backstory because I think it's important that we harp on what you've done in the past and what how
Right.
you got to peer to peer and you've even done we were
Yeah.
talking earlier about Robert Anton Wilson and transhumanism. You're clearly all over the map. So
Right. Yeah. So let me just refer to a book that I really loved when I was younger, and I recommend it to everybody. It's called Varieties of Religious Experience. It's from William James. Wrote it back in the 1910s, I guess. And it's a biography of all the people who created religions, right? And he says there's two kinds of people: the once born and the twice born. Once born people are people who are born lucky, nice parents, nice village, nice time period, and because of that, they don't have to rock the boat. They kind of fit, in what is expected of them, and they find their place. And then there's people, and I guess I belong to those kinds of people where you're born and you say, what? what the F is this? There's something wrong with the operating system, right? And that's kind of like the gnostic condition. You're in the world, but you're not of this world, and you feel like you don't fit. And so William James says that those kinds of people, if they want to be happy, they have to go through a lot of experiences, and then something will happen. They'll crash, and then they'll kind of reborn, and then they're richer than other people because they had to do things that most normal people didn't have to do to arrive at that happy place, right? I, I'm kind of that kind of a person. So I was very unhappy as a child. Very poor, orphan, working class parents, leaking roof. I was taken away from my parents when I was 18 months old. So you feel like there's a feeling of abandonment, and I became a Marxist first when I was like 14 years old.
It happens.
It happens. And then, that didn't work out. And then I joined a sex commune when I was like 21, around the ideas of Wilhelm Reich, who is a really interesting
Nice work.
guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Orgon or no
And
gon,
so, yeah, exactly. I spent some time in the organ boxes and stuff. And I actually want to visit Organon in I think it's in New Hampshire. Um, And then I kind of said, okay, I need to do more. So I went into, the human potential stuff. Almost everything that you heard about in the 70s and 80s, I've done it. Then I went into spirituality. So I've done a lot of Eastern stuff, Sufi workshops, meditation. And I ended up, circling around Rajneesh, and I actually was in Rajneeshpuram 1 year before it collapsed. So if you know about the movie Wild Wild Country on Netflix, which is a fantastic documentary on how it all went wrong, I was there.
wow.
So then I went to the western side. I said, okay, well, I've seen the East, and I've seen a lot of scumbag gurus. Let's see if there is any. And so I've been a Templar, I've been a Rosicrucian, I've been a Mason. So I had a teacher of alchemy. I did tarot cards, and then somehow, like by my mid 30s, I settled down, and I thought I had enough tools, so I wanted to become like creative, and so that's actually called central version, right? So basically, people who are twice born, in the first part of their life, they frantically try to fit in. Uh, but then there's something happens in the second part of your life where you say, F it. I'm trying to use dirty words here. And basically, then what you actually want to change the world. You want to adapt the world to you rather than the other way around, right? So that's called central version. And so in the 90s, I did started a magazine that was called Wave. That was like Wired and Mono 2000 in one. It was like we tried to make some this synthesis. Then two startups, internet startups. Then I made a documentary which is called Technocalypse, the metaphysics of technology and the end of man. So that's the time we before we talked for this podcast, we talked a bit together, and that's when we interviewed Terence McKenna, we interviewed Robert Adel Wilson, many interesting people, 40
You're
people.
tied right into the Discordia if you connected with Terence McKenna and Robert Anton Wilson. I think everyone that's we're
Yeah.
all
I
pretty
was always
jealous.
interested in this, these kind of marginal, things and stuff, certainly at that time. And so but then I got a burnout. I'm talking about the late 90s. Um my father died, my mother got Alzheimer. I discovered there was cheating in my accounting. That documentary, that it had trouble coming out. There were a few fights. Uh, Everything that could go wrong went wrong. So I had a burnout, and then I thought, like, what do I need to do? It's the midlife crisis. Like, what do you need to do to be happy? Because you're halfway, and if you don't do it now, and I was profoundly somebody who wanted to do like I know it sounds silly nowadays, but make the world a better place. That was like
Yeah.
a
So
very
90s.
profound motivation. Yeah, and I decided to go for it, and that's when I discovered. So the story is a bit the opposite of what you say. Is I was inspired by peer-to-peer computing to look at peer-to-peer as a social relationship.
Right.
So if you can do peer-to-peer computing, then people can also do it. And so for me, the big change of the internet is trans-local self-organizing, right? Civilization has always been about geography, about the village and the town. It's the civilization is a relationship between the city and the countryside, basically. Um, and now we're in a different situation where we still have that, but we're creating this second layer where people can, as peers, self-organize trans geographically, uh, and create value together, create new economies together. And so, and then that is
Peer
then
to peer
associated
values.
in my, yeah, with what I call the commons. And maybe we can talk about it later. But for me, it's like the forgotten institution of human history, and that we need to bring back. I won't say more right now, but maybe that's one of the topics we can discuss. And so, anyway, I created the peer-to-peer foundation to monitor and observe how this peer-to-peer dynamic would change basically everything. And I have a wiki.p2pfoundation.net, with 40,000 articles now, which had been viewed a billion times already, like 5, 6 years ago. And anybody who uses ChatGPT and stuff will see that it's used in a major way by the AI
Yeah.
chatbots. They really use it, because it's internet stuff disappears, and I keep track of it. So I always copy significant portions of articles, and so they're no longer available on the internet, but they're still there on my wiki. Anyway, so that's so created a peer-to-peer foundation. Um, then I got a big I was canceled in 2018. So that was like a huge thing for me. I got, debanged, de-PayPal, de-platformed, blacklisted,
Your
all the things
ideas
that
just
happened.
sound they just stressed people out because of the names of them. Yeah, I think, right? Because I think at one point you talked about Ron Paul Maoism, right? Which was just
Oh yeah,
these are
yeah,
very
yeah.
these are heterodox words, and you make them make perfect sense when they go together. But I think it scares people from either side. Like Ron Paul's afraid of
Exactly.
Mao.
Yeah.
Mao's afraid.
We are
Yeah.
we are not we are not in a period where people like me can be very popular, because I don't you probably know the name Erasmus, right? So he was one of
Hmm.
this great Renaissance scholar, putting things together. But once the Reformation War started, he fell because he was not Catholic enough for the Catholics, and he was not Protestant enough for the Protestants, right? So he became much less popular, and so when you have a crisis of civilization, you get atomization, and when you get atomization, you get polarization, because if you're alone, you look at who is most like me. And so the right wing is doing it, around nationalism, religion, the nation state, MAGA, but the left is doing it around race and gender and wokeism.
Identity
So
politics.
basically both sides are atomizing, fragmentation, and then also polarizing against each other, right? The pagans against the Christians, the Reformation against the Catholics, and now it's the culture war. And if you're integrative, if you try to hold contradictory truth, right? You say, well, what if the left was partially right, and what if the right was partially right, and no one has the truth? That's actually not a popular position right now,
Yeah,
because
because then you get the left and the
afraid.
right to
Well put.
stop. They stop fighting each
Yeah,
other and they turn like Matrix agents and start trying to kill you. That's you basically get.
yeah. They're soldiers in a culture war, right? That's why the media are no longer trustworthy, because if you're a journalist now, and I saw it in a CBS workshop, they don't teach you like to be truthful. They tell you your priority is to keep the narrative, right? So, but it's on both sides. It's not that one side is they both feel they're in a war, in an existential war against each other, and so it's hard for people who don't fit in these boxes. Unfortunately, I wish it wasn't that way, because you pay the price. You pay the price.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, you brought up an interesting point already, just talking about identity politics and how we're easily controlled by it, but then also that there's kind of a material obsession with. Why do you think it is that the left, which is supposedly a compassionate ideology, is so obsessed with the materialism of the identity politic, while the right is more functionally, perhaps, I want to say more functional in their ideology, but also focused on the materialism of get rich quick schemes.
Yeah. So I think a good difference between left and right remains like how they see community, right? And so there's a paradox. Usually the right wing, wants to protect their community, and they can have a lot of solidarity inside their community. Like, that you're willing to die for your country.
Hmm.
That's courage, right? And you're willing to die for your religion and all those things. And the left wing wants to extend that basically to the whole of humanity. The problem, of course, if you do that, is that the danger is that you love everybody in the abstract but nobody in the particular, right? So you tend to have left-wing people who are very vocal about love and solidarity, but not really acting it out locally. um, and then paradoxically, certainly nowadays, is that the cultural liberalism is about individualism, right? So paradoxically, the left is much more concerned about individual rights, and they're educated people, so they're relatively uprooted from their kind of like local moorings. So if you look for your identity on the right, it's more easy because it's your village, it's your religion, it's your nation. If you're on the left, what's your identity? If you have a unhealthy identity formation, it's going to be your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, right? It's going to be a much more uh, less rooted identity, and that is what is happening. That both sides are going back to the smaller identities, and what people like me work on, we call it cosmolocalism, is basically the idea is everything that's heavy should be local, and everything that's light should be global and shared, right?
Hmm.
So we want to go back to a world where there's actually more local identity, where people can be different from each other, rooted in their bioregion and stuff like that. But at the same time, they're working together at a global scale through digital commons, right? And so let me make a little argument. So we actually have three main institutions in our world, right? That's the commons, the market, and state. So if you look at empire, monarchies, the commons are actually part of the system. They're respected. So in the Middle Ages, European farmers have their common land. They have their family plot. They work for the land of the Lord, but they also have a common land. And the biggest religious festival in the year is called the Rogentide procession, and it's when the people in the parish go around their village, reconfirming their common land, and it's called beating the bounds because they would put these white boundary markers right in the ground,
Hmm.
right? That was as important as Easter and Christmas for the majority of the people in the Middle Ages. But under the capitalist system, we believe that private property works better, and so this is the first system that has really rooted out the common physical resources that were part of life, right? But it's coming back with the digital, right? Everybody who discovers the internet says, wow, we can work together locally and create knowledge commons. We can learn together, we can learn from each other. in real time all the time. And that has brought back the commons paradoxically. And so now what people are discovering, people are relocalizing, they're going back to their, community land trusts and, urban gardening. It's very much in the air. But they're also discovering, well, if we work together with all the other people in the world doing the same thing, we are much stronger, right? And in a way, you can bypass the nation state. You can say, let's unite all the permaculture communities in the world, and you don't have to pass through the nation state. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. Yeah, I see
It's
Ron Paul
funny.
Maoism.
It's funny because you already have a opponent, an ideological opponent, which was Steve Bannon created Trump Leninism, and I just think
Right.
it's really fantastic that you came out with Ron Paul Maoism first, and that I'm sure that Steve Bannon has heard the expression, has heard the phrase, and from that to create Trump Leninism. Do you think you can see a big difference between those two ideologies? What do you think the difference is
Ah,
in MAGA
well,
Leninism versus Ron Paul,
yeah.
right?
So the thing is that there's a paradox, right? In that the so this is a story about Web3. Let me just put a few markers here. So in '93, we invent the browser and the web. So why is this important? Because it democratizes the internet. It goes from something that was used by scientists and the military. Now the whole world can use it, and over time, that's actually what happened. With 5 billion people on it. So then, in 2008, 2009, we invent Bitcoin, right? The first socially sovereign currency in the world. So you have a globally scalable currency that doesn't need the state nor a market player to sustain it. It's a community that believes in that protocol. In order for Bitcoin to work, it creates the blockchain, right? And the blockchain is the first universal ledger in the history of the world. Until that moment, every ledger was like a private ledger. You can see if you get richer and you don't see any of the impact. Now we have global 3D accounting. Anybody can connect with everybody in a global ledger. By the way, just for the little story, I was the only person that Satoshi Nakamoto wrote to in private outside of the cypherpunk mailing list.
Wow.
And he published his white paper on the site of the P2P Foundation. Very few people know that, but that's, and I don't know why. I don't know who he
Origin
is.
story.
I wrote to him and he wrote back, but I don't know who he was. Anyway, so just to get back to that storyline, so the invention of a global ledger, right? So that creates DAOs eventually, right? So digitally born organizational forms that can fund their own commons because open source couldn't do it. So if you think about free software, it's a commons, it's shared code. But if you don't work for the business, you don't make money, and so then IBM comes in to support Linux, etc., etc. And what Web3 did, and the philosophy of Web3 is try to recreate the real internet, but this time protected against private appropriation. They're taxing themselves because they use cryptocurrencies for everything. They create things like Gitcoin, and then they fund their own collective infrastructure, right? That's so important. And that's why it's a paradox that people who are thinking as libertarians, because most of them think as libertarians, are actually creating this commons infrastructure. That's why I called it Ron Paul Maoism, right? And it's you could say maybe the same about Bannon, that he's very conservative, but he's using these kind of Leninist strategies from the Bolsheviks. He's a very strategic thinker, right? He's a very systemic thinker, Bannon. Whether you agree with him or not, like Karl Rove. Karl Rove was a systems thinker. Now, maybe you can think that he uses it for evil, but he still understood how systems worked. And it's the same with Bannon. He knows how systems work, right? He's schooled in complexity theory, systems theory.
Right.
He thinks about class, in a
Karl
way, he
Rove is
thinks
one
like
of
a
the first
Marxist.
people. Yeah, is that Karl Rove is one of the first people to call neoconservatives Marxists, and it's an accepted. These days in
Yeah.
political science, it's completely accepted that neoconservatives are a form of Marxist because of Karl Rove.
Well,
Right.
they originated there, right? James Burnham was a Trotskyite,
Hmm.
and by the way, I was a Trotskyite as well in late teens and early 20s.
We all
And
were.
you know why? And you know why this is? Because so I have to tell you this, and this is very important. Why people don't understand why there's so many ex-Marxists in high positions. It's because it's a school of organization. So if you're part of these movements, like I was, right? Every 2 weeks we had a discussion, analysis of the Belgian situation. And then the other 2 weeks we had a discussion, analysis of the global situation. Like if you do that years in a row, what you get is like your brain becomes able to see, forces at play, right? You see them. And that's the only way. So you actually become a systems thinker, right? And then maybe you abandon your original engagement, but your skills are still there. So that's why they're in demand in many organizations. So if I give you an example in Thailand, that we had this a Chinese billionaire, Thaksin Shinawatra, who wanted to take power and it got elected 3 times. And these were the red shirts. And then you had the yellow shirts. And here's the story: the yellow shirts were the former communists, and the king had made peace with them and giving them positions in the royal cooperatives, the royal foundations that do organic food and stuff, right? So they're conservative communists that support the monarchy. Those that didn't find a job in the monarchy went into the NGOs, and they were mobilized by Taksin, right? So it's not because these people are still 100% in that ideology, but it's because they've been trained as leaders and in organizational, capacity.
Right.
And where
And
else
there's certain
where else
social goals.
can you learn that?
Absolutely.
So what's next, guys?
I was waiting for Raph.
uh,
No,
I
well,
could say a bit
go on.
about the evolution of the commons if you like.
That would be good. Yeah,
Yes,
actually.
yes.
Yeah. So for the people who don't understand what it means, so the commons is three things, right? It's a shared resource that is maintained by a group of people, a community or a group of stakeholders, and has its own self-governance. So that's very important. So it's not private and it's not public. It's not the state. It's not the market. And historically, first there were physical resources like fishermen organizing, the fishing so that they don't overfish. Farmers organizing access to the farmland so that they don't overfarm. So that's the original commons. So when capitalism emerges, we chase away the farmers for their common land, and they become workers in the cities and they die when they're 30. So what are they doing is they pool their life risks. So that's the second phase of the commons. So as the commons adapt to industrial society, they become social commons. So all our social security systems come from that, from the self-organizing of labor, in order to manage their life risks. It's taken over by the state eventually and becomes a welfare state. The third phase is when we get cognitive society, and then now we get digital commons, right? So that's the free software, open design, Wikipedia, all of that. The fourth phase, which I'm working on, is the phygital commons, is the merger of the physical and the digital. And so the model that I propose for the future is where you have distributed manufacturing, relocalized distributed manufacturing with open designs, where you can make more and more things locally because we spend two to three times more on transport than on making. And if you believe like me that we do have a real ecological crisis, then we will have to do something about it. And relocalizing, you save 2/3 of matter energy expenditure, but then you learn from everybody in the whole world, right?
And so you
And you
call
can
this
have very fast
cosmo-localism, right?
innovation. Yeah, that's what I call cosmolocalism. Yeah. It's trying to combine the best of localization and the best of planetarization, because we need both. You cannot solve all the problems at a local level. Like, there are 400 nuclear sites in the world, right? They have a half-life of 100,000 years. There's no way you can manage that locally. It's just can't do it. So we will need to, it's not just that we want to, but we need to conserve our capacity to maintain a complex technological society. It's just a necessity, and the best way, in my view, to do that is in this cosmolocal way. So high tech and very local. High tech, high touch.
And so you say you've talked about pulsations in the commons from
Yeah,
shifts between extractive and regenerative phases. Do you feel like
right.
we're in an extractive phase
Oh
or a
yeah,
regenerative
absolutely.
phase?
Yeah, yeah. So the pulsation of the commons is a theory that so when markets and states go well, the commons weaken, and even and the cabinets almost completely disappear. But when markets and states go down, and they always do, because they always overuse, so it's nothing new. Capitalism just does it better than before. So, we exhaust the whole world rather than only a region. So if you look at every civilization in the past, it died. Every single civilization dies because it overuses its local resource base. And then what you have is in the down phase of the civilization, the commons come back up. And when you have a dark age, you only have the commons. So that's why the monasteries come back, whether it's in China, in Japan, or in Europe. When you have a dark age and they last around 500 years with at least three of them, three big ones, right? What you see in each case is that monasteries become the hegemonic institution, and they're commons. They're collectively owned institutions that don't work for profit, but for the maintenance and the healing of the land that they are working on, right? So you can actually measure this, like the pollen count goes up in dark ages, biodiversity goes up in dark ages. And
Hmm.
so if you look at cycles, which I've done quite a bit myself, you have to conclude that we are the end of many, many different cycles at the same time.
Hmm.
That's why we're such a deep crisis. That's why people call it a meta crisis. Right? I actually think it's a crisis of civilization itself, right? Civilization was a response to a climate crisis, and humanity decided we need to manage nature in order to survive and to stay put where we are, right? So the first civilization was about managing water in the river basins in Mesopotamia, Yellow River, and all of that, right? And I think that paradigm of dominating nature is now questionable. So we need to have a participatory paradigm, but at a higher level of complexity, of course, than indigenous people. Because indigenous people, that's great, but how many million people were on the planet? A few million, right? So we can't just go back. We have to have like a neo-indigenous and I think that's what peer-to-peer is about. Peer-to-peer is about attempting to recreate a new form of tribalism, new forms of trust and reciprocity, within the Dunbar number, but around affinity, not kinship. I think this is what humanity is trying to do right now. We're trying to create new tribes. And in a way, what we're seeing is civilization is kind of breaking down. Trust is breaking down because, civilization is trust at scale, right? And if you look at what is Web3 trying to do, trustlessness actually means trust over the whole world, right? Can we design technologies that people in the whole world can trust each other without needing a common religion or belonging to the same nation state?
But then
That's
what does
that's
that?
on the agenda. That's on the agenda.
Well, okay. So the assumptions you talk a lot also about challenging assumptions. And you brought up how Bitcoin was, blockchain was kind of released through your peer-to-peer website, like it was introduced this way. Is it a Trojan horse for government, or a Trojan horse for corporations and technology? Do you see what assumptions are corporations and governments needing to realize their misassumptions about? And is there a place for governments and corporations still in a world that is so I was gonna say cosmopolitan, but cosmo localized, like you said?
Yeah. So I think Web3 and crypto is a bet on the collapse of the nation state, right?
Of course, yeah.
So within the elites, money elites, techno elites, but also coding elites, there is the sense that things are going the wrong direction. And Bitcoin and crypto are like an arbitrage mechanism between nation states. Like if Portugal collapses, we go to Greece. If Greece collapses, we go to Thailand, etc., etc. So, and I think the value itself of Bitcoin is a bet on the collapse of the nation state. And so I think within capitalism, there are forces that are fully aware of that see bad things coming, and they're positioning themselves to survive in this disintegrating world, right? And what will come up, I think, is maybe some nation states will survive, maybe China or Dubai, but I think there's also this attempt, network states, network nations. There are more and more attempts of people to create other types of communities which can survive hard times, and they're not necessarily geographic. Some people want to combine it. They want to do network states, right? Some other people,
Shared
it's more like a
economies.
guild, like a global guild. So within Web3, you have guilds now, like the Protocol Guild and Guild and the Raider guilds, and there are all kinds of guilds coming up, right? So these are solidarity mechanisms that don't depend on your nation. They're translocal. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to create this level. So think about it. You're in the 14th century in Italy, right? The Renaissance, beautiful cities, beautiful art, but also a lot of fighting, right? All these cities fight each other. And then suddenly they invent the cannon and the musket. And so the only people who can afford that are the kings of, Holland, of France, Spain. And so they start invading Italy, right? So at that time, a city state is no longer viable. So people start thinking about nations. And this is where we are now, but except that the nations are becoming endangered, and people thinking, well, how can we survive better than with a nation state? So I'm not saying that process is finished, but it has
Yeah,
started.
but there's wolves in
And this
sheep's
is where we
clothing,
are, in this. Well, it
like
depends. I
Uber
think
and
in the beginning,
Airbnb, Amazon.
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm
So
just
shared
I
shared
wondering
think,
economies.
how does this get
yeah,
hijacked by the centralized systems, and they just kind of feign to use this type of
but
technology?
so there's a kind of struggle going on, right? So you have, where are the big forces today? It's basically BlackRock and two or three of these, pure ownership companies, right? And they're very, very strong, but nation states are still very strong as well, right? The US and China, but they're positioning themselves towards each other because they need each other, but they also sometimes have different interests. And so there's a lot going on there between these, polarities. Do we go fully transnational, or and there are forces like in China and in the US who are anti-globalist and anti-BlackRock, right? I think the current administration is more localist than it is globalist, for example. But it's
In
all
China or the
complicated
United
because
States?
they have allies on every side and stuff. But anyways, so I think that's what's going on. People are position, it's an uncertain future. Everybody knows the current system is going down, but nobody knows for sure what's next. And so it's all a game of placing bets and making alliances, and and so if you look at the 16th century, you will see there are many different models in the 16th century, right? There's city-states, there's new dynastics, there are trading alliances like the Hanseatic League. There are parliamentary systems in the UK, absolute monarchies, because nobody knew actually what the new thing will be, and eventually the nation state becomes dominant. But it takes a while. So we're not going to go to the next system immediately. It's going to be like, a very interesting, Gramsci said, when the old is dying and the new isn't there yet, it's the time of monsters, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we are now in a time of monsters. And I think there's two big coalitions. One is let's say the Davos coalition, which is the Western mercantile, business oriented, pseudo-democratic, in my view, and they want multi-stakeholder governance, right? So if you look at what Davos wants, is 400, domain-specific multi-stakeholder governance alliances with money, weak nation states, and approved NGOs, but no people. There's no more voting in that system. And then you have China, Russia, and the BRICS, and they want to go back to strong nation states and even what they call civilization states, right? Even China, which is formerly a communist regime, they are installing Confucian institutes everywhere. So they're going back to their own tradition. Modi in India, Russia with Dugin. So these are the two models that are fighting it out. But what I represent, and people that are going that direction, is like the hope that there is something new coming, not just a renewed nation state or this kind of business vision of the world, but something that is different. And I do think that any future system will have to be able to solve the environmental issue, but also the social issue. Like you cannot have too much inequality. There's always a point where, when it's too much, you get backlash. When people lose their stake in the system, you will have backlash. Think about it. Like New York just voted a very radical,
Mm-hmm.
leftist mayor. That was unthinkable for the last 30 years, right?
Reactionary mutation of consciousness. Is that something like that?
Well, before you can go to the next step, you have regression, right?
So it's like a pendulum.
So you have an existing level of complexity which is no longer able to manage the complexity, and so it's disintegrating. We're still in the phase of disintegrating, but within that, what you have to look for are seed forms, what the pre-regime called seeds of coherence, right? In a sea of chaos, seeds of coherence can change everything. So I look at the seed forms. So this is my job. I look at seed forms. What is being invented right now? Does it work? And to answer your question, because I didn't answer it, so I think like a DAO is a fourth generation governance mechanism, because you have, tribes, markets, and states. But a DAO can integrate, permissionless contribution, so the neo-tribalism. It can make deals with governments, and it can accept private money and business, right? So it's like a meta organization. It's something new. That is, but I think that the commons has to be the central institution of the future, because it's the only institution which can preserve the ecology of the world. Marxists and states, they only look out for themselves, and so we don't have a common good institution anymore. This is the crisis, right? The state is supposed to regulate the market, but now that the market is transnational, there is no transnational state, and so we have lost the capacity for regulation.
you were saying that you grew up in the West and you saw a lot of the collapse of the system, kind of the Gnostic condition that you were born into, the collapsing of the West. But you spent the last 20 years in the East, right? As you've been living in Asia. So do you brought up a little bit about what you see happening with Dugin in Russia and the the isolatory Confucianist bank systems, the Confucianist markets in China. But how do you see a major difference between the West and the East
Oh yeah, I
philosophies?
do. I do. So I have to correct you. I actually lived through the upswing of the West. When I was young,
Fair.
this was the welfare state. I'm born in 58. The 60s and 70s were, the last 20 years of this incredible growth of the welfare state and consumerism and so I'm and that's what young people today don't understand. Like a lot of right-wing people, for example, they will say, oh, Mandani wants the state to do grocery stores, and they think, crazy. But for my generation, the state did very complex public transport way better than the private sector,
Sure.
and the post office way better than the private post offices. So my experience is not that bad. The state did a lot for working class people when I was young, right? Of course,
Yeah,
now
better
it's
than what
changed.
Belgium did in the Congo before our
So
lifetimes. Yeah. Fair.
what would you say, what happened now that it seems the state has become so exceedingly inefficient, and also whilst welfare state or the idea of charity maybe previously had been more localized or more direct. Now it's of course all within the state system, especially in the West. And from the few of the statistics I understand, there is, I'm not sure, 50, 70% of individuals in the West or in the UK actually receive some type of benefit money from the state, which is financed potentially through exploitation of third world countries, financial constructs, and so on. At the same time, it removes any sense of, I don't want to say worth, but maybe purpose for many individuals because they can't properly find a job. It's not easy
Yeah,
to start anything. How do you see that situation, or
I
how?
think in a way it's a tragedy of the commons because the welfare systems originally were solidarity systems self-organized by the labor movement, right? And that gave people purpose and there was concrete solidarity between the people. Once you statify it, you become an individual consumer of a public service, right? And so that atomizes society. So in some way it's good because it generalizes it to the whole population, but in another way it then starts undermining any sense of collective agency. And then and then I'm sorry to say this, but when you have um, exceedingly amounts of migration, then also like the identity of people becomes problematic, and people start thinking, well, I'm hardworking, but they are not hardworking. Should we pay for them? So you get all these. The only country in Europe that maintains its social security system is Denmark. That's the only one where it's still popular. Um, anyway, that's another issue, a
Another,
touchy issue. But
no, they're small.
so
They're a
let me
smaller
let
state, so they have they're a national socialist. I mean, I
yeah,
don't
but
want to
they
call them that, but
also they also regulated migration in a way, and so
right.
they maintained more social cohesion. So then let's go to living in Asia. So in many ways, living in Asia is like living in Europe 30, 40 years ago. You know, you should see them as like being 50 to 20 years, you know, behind the curve that we went through, right? So they for example, if you live in Thailand, you had 30 years of growth, and that so basically if you think about the BRICS, ideology, it can be, summarized as now it's our turn. Now it's our turn. That's how they're thinking, you know. Is it real? Is it illusion? That's a debate because I think ecological crises are accelerating. So I don't think they'll have many, many years to think that way. And as you can see, the US is not laying down either. It's not accepting its decline, and it's gonna, you know, make a lot of noise and disturbing the whole system. But I would say, what makes it nicer nowadays to live in Asia is this sense of positive expectation that most people still have. And going back to Europe in a way is always a bit depressing because, there's very few people that I see that have a capacity to project themselves in the future. They just can't see it. And so this is a problem. I think right now Europe is not in a good shape. The US is not in good shape. Um, Now, as a European, I have to tell you, and you probably know this, the quality of life in Europe is still amazing. Because, in Asia, in many places, you don't have footpaths. It's hot. This kind of like relaxed walking that you can have in European cities with beautiful historical environments. This is rare. It's rare in the world. And this is something that Europe has, that there's a quality of life that is, precious, I think.
But there's an expense to it. And do you think that this is part of maybe a long-term globalist goal to equalize the East with the West? Corporations since Kissinger's period investing in creating some sort of an equalizer, an equitable partner out of the East. Do you think that there's more of an effort for this or not really?
Yeah, but I think it started earlier. I think it started in 68, right? So in 68, you have, a real serious revolt. Because people think about the students, but, there were 10 million workers on strike in Paris, and de Gaulle left the country. He thought it was finished, right? And so basically, I think what happened then in 68 is a decision by the ruling class that, okay, let's give rock and roll to the students because they are children, but we can't compromise with the works. It's too expensive. So let's deindustrialize, right?
Hmm.
And so they started investing in the global south. They started capping the wages in the West and replacing it with debt, with credit, cheap credit. And so if you were working class, you got cheaper goods from the global south. So even with the same amount of money, you had the impression that you could still buy things. You could buy on credit, so you didn't have to save to get a fridge. You could buy the fridge up front. Um, so that was like a strategic decision to abandon their own working classes, and then it accelerated in the 70s and the 80s. So I think this is a long-standing decision that took time to play out. Until the situation today is that, the West has no industry. Like we saw with COVID, we couldn't access medications, equipment, um, and yeah, now we're in serious trouble. I think it was Raphael. You said something about the surplus. You're right. The welfare state, in a way, was basically on the back of the global south through neocolonialism, through debt domination, through debt of Africa and Latin America. So sucking the surplus to Europe, but also on nature, right? Because all the hockey stick developments on resources and climate change, they all start in 1950s. It's like this before, and then it goes like this. So it's in that way it's unsustainable, and that's where the commons comes in. In my view, the only way to maintain a complex society is through mutualization, right? It's, for example, if you're in a neighborhood like in Ghent, and I did a study on Ghent, you do a car sharing club. So that they have co-ops and associations in Ghent with thousands of members, right? So you have a block, and you decide to use pooled cars. So you can have the same amount of point-to-point transport with each shared car replaces 9 to 13 private cars. So you maintain complexity at a much lower matter energy cost and financial cost. Now, you can do that two ways. One is the ways which is happening now, which is a neoliberal way, which is Uber and Airbnb. But they're often often has perverse effects,
Absolutely.
right?
Like
Isn't
to
that
elaborate on
Uber,
that, Chris? Yeah.
Isn't that similar
yeah,
to what you mentioned with the state, that it gets too, I'm not sure, too large in a way? So instead of actually contributing to some type of connectivity on the local level, it's again atomizing everyone, because it's like it's too big and there is no relationship. And
Yeah.
also, of course, there is no real profit or resource sharing. It just gets siphoned off by these platforms because they kind of got hip to the idea, oh, we can do this. This is what I find in, I want to say, even in online games or in anything, that whilst there would be the technological capacity for co-ops, for sharing, food sharing, anything, it's always getting siphoned off into these apps, which are then probably, some Silicon Valley VC, and they siphon off all the benefit and the efficiency. And it's almost impossible to recreate it on a local level. Not impossible, but it's made difficult because people think, oh, we already have this super large solution, which of course is well marketed because they have infinite money for it, but we don't actually get the real benefit in terms of efficiency and less costs for the individual.
I completely agree with this.
Nor do we get the social benefit of actually connecting to the local level. But we're all like, again, atomized as like in a welfare system.
Plus automation. So Uber is a great example, because what's Uber's end game? It's to destroy all of the unions of taxi cab drivers around the world, make the price so low through efficiency that eventually they can have self-driving cars, or at least own a company like Waymo or something that does self-driving cars that will replace the worker entirely. And is that a good thing in the long run? Or, I mean, it's
to be honest, and maybe I'm revealing my age here, but for the last 10 years, I do not have a feeling that new tech is making my life better.
Yeah, well, it's
on the
true
contrary.
for everybody. Yeah,
I think it sucks.
everything was cool
5
years ago, and then we're just reusing it with new ad-based models and everything, right? Yahoo Radio Chat was better than paying $500 a month or what year for Zoom or whatever is going on with that. Yeah, it's correct. So
yes, I think we might, so I studied macro historians, right? So these are people who are look at the whole history over a very long time period. So I started reading Spengler, The Decline of the West, Toynbee, A Study of History, Sorokin, Quigley, and a whole bunch of them. And so one guy is interesting. It's Pitirim Sorokin. He's a Russian who lived through the Russian Revolution and then moved to the US. And he says that civilizational changes happen through bifurcations. And he distinguishes ideate and sensate civilizations. A sensate civilization, like the ones we have, believes in matter, empiricism, rationalism, science. Only the material is real, right? And then everything is calculated. And as with every civilization, it emerges, it grows, it peaks, it slows, right? So then the change is not more of the same. The change will be a bifurcation away from it. So, for example, the younger Roman Empire is hedonistic, and it's all about pleasure and stuff. So, what does it provoke? The Christian reaction, right? Asceticism, away from the body. And the same with Buddhism in China and Taoism. So you have to place them in time, and what you see is that they react to another period, and then they themselves degenerate, and then they, for example, in the 15th century, if you're a merchant in a city, you think, what are all these lazy monks doing, and we're paying taxes for them, right? So that's like a bifurcation from ideate to sensate, and we've been in hypersensate in a degenerate hypersensate civilization, and we seem stuck in it. But it might provoke either a integrative reaction, which is what I hope, that the best of matter and the best of spirits in some new type of mixing, which happens occasionally, or it's going to be like a total rejection of everything we stand for today. You know, and don't forget, we might have to, right? Like when people can no longer have things, then how will you be happy if you don't have something to replace it, which is spiritual, relational development, right? And
At
that's going to
least
be a totally different.
virtual values, right? You can gamify it. Yeah.
Yeah.
This
Mm.
for the synthetic spiritualist that was an atheist in 1996. What about you propose common base pure production could be a cornerstone of a post-capitalist economy? What are the key economic mechanisms needed to scale this model globally?
All right, that's an easy question.
And all right, well, like nuance it, and maintains. I want to say maintain some equitability.
Yeah, but
Unless you
I
think that's
think
not
so. What I'd
necessary.
like to do is, look at what's happening, right? And so, peer production means a thing. It means that from now on, we have an open ecosystem in which people can see what is needed and they can self-allocate their effort. So that's what open source and is about, right? So you have Linux. Everybody can see what Linux needs. Everybody can see what Wikipedia needs, and you can say, "Oh, I can do that." And if it's successful, it actually creates an economy around it. So the software itself is freely copyable, but it needs maintenance, certification, education, adaptation, and so it creates this huge business around it. And already in 2011, there was a report from the CCIA, not the CIA, and it calculated that 16% of US GDP was already then derived from open resources, right? Um, so that was the first step, is open source, and then you create companies around it. But the problem of open source was they couldn't finance the core, and so it got dominated by these big companies. So the second step is crypto. So now what you do is you crowdfund financing. So you can go around VCs, you can go around banks, you can, have tokens, token investment. So you get distributed investment, right? And then you create this DO type system that aligns coders and funders. Basically, it's an ingenious system of aligning incentives to make everybody in the ecosystem work in the same direction. And then you invent new ways of voting, like quadratic voting, quadratic funding, that give more weight to small investors and coders and contributors than to big wallets. So this is where we are. This is like, empirically we have created this. So what is missing for me is it has to be connected with physical production, and that's not happening yet. But that's what I want to see happening. So I want crypto for real, and I want to connect all these millions of people trying to do relocalized production and have a very hard time doing it and not find capital to do it. And I want to convince, even if it was only 5% of these $3 trillion that are floating around, and say, guys, if you keep just being parasites, they will come for you for the pitchforks. But if you invest in local eco villages and organic food and renewable energy collectives, you can go in the whole world and you'll be accepted as peers in these communities. So that's exactly what happened at the end of the Roman Empire. Let me briefly tell you that. So, when Rome collapses, it no longer has food, right? Because the food comes from Egypt. And inside Italy, they only have olive oil and wine, slaves. So no more food, the city's empties out, and it's the monastics, right, who reorganize food production, the Benedictines. In 50 years, they restore the food production in Italy. But if you're a Roman elite, what do? Now you have Germanic kings. You can no longer go in the army. Well, what you do is you support the Catholic Church because your children can be managers there. You can live there, when you retire. You have your own culture, and so there's this kind of synthesis
Interesting.
between the Roman elites and the Christians, right? And so that's my vision. I know it's weird, but that's
No,
how
that
I
makes
see
perfect
it.
sense.
You need jurisdictional alliances between people at the bottom, the middle, and the top. We're
Just
not there yet.
imagine
That's
the elite as the
that.
people are coming with their pitchforks. So like, don't you remember where you got your pitchforks? We mass manufactured your pitchforks for you in China. Don't come after
Yeah.
me. Yeah. Well,
So,
so go ahead.
just briefly,
So
since you
yeah.
oh, please
Go
go
ahead.
on, go on. No, I just
No,
want
I was just
to
going to say,
juxtapose the eco village with the
go
whole
ahead.
15-minute city, CO2 certificate, which of course is only a, how should I say, a shield put in front of the real ecological issues and the real issues that we have with, for example, the moving of manufacturing on such a large scale. So I recently saw one small short with maybe 10 views of some Chinese individual, and they were like, oh yeah, you want to take all the industry back? Don't you realize how much this pollutes the environment? And I'm not even saying this is necessarily so with modern technology, but I kind of see this eco-village concept, or the globalized cosmo village, however, or planetized, I like that word, as a counter model to the 15-minute chip in your head, you're not allowed, China model, basically. Yeah? And I'm just wondering, just like you said, I see it similarly, that it is not sustainable if there is too much inequality, even not for the elite, because they are never safe then. Because you can build a
Yeah,
bunker as
exactly.
deep as
And
you want,
Mark
you will never be
Zuckerberg
safe.
Mark Zuckerberg is building this 20-story under the ground, and they have islands, they have rocks. But I met the Moynihan brothers, and they are internet millionaires or billionaires, I'm not sure, but anyway, they have. And they're financing and living in eco villages in New Zealand, right? They don't have to be afraid of their own guards, right? And the billionaires are right to be afraid, because the people who took over power in Rome were the gods, and the gods were the legions of the Romans. They didn't come from outside. They were the people that the Romans were paying to protect them. And then they said, well, why don't we take over? And so if you're a billionaire and you have to pay 200 people with guns to protect you, you ultimately have no guarantee, right? So that's why you need like a religion in a way, right? And so I met people, you can find him on the internet, E.M. Burlingame. He's working on a new knighthood, right? Because you need people who believe in something that to defend it. And so that's what the knights were about, right? The knights, they were at the service of the church and the Lord. They believed in something. We don't have to believe in the same things, but I'm just saying you need a body of people who are not just there because you are giving them money. Because the moment you stop giving them money, they're no longer loyal. What you want is a system where both working class and middle class and the ruling class are embedded in one system that they believe in. And this is something I think we lost in the West. It's just gone. That's why we're in this kind of nihilistic uh, phase where we only believe in our personal goals. And even that, many people are no longer able to project themselves in the future in their personal goals. So we have a meaning crisis. I don't know how we're going to solve this, but But this is
Well,
what civilizational crisis is about. It's a meaning crisis. I always say the ultimate building block of the universe is meaning,
the moment that
not atoms.
the right
Yeah.
wingers, the moment the neoconservatives started calling themselves Marxists and the Chinese communists started becoming capitalists, I think we kind of move towards the direction of how we're going to find meaning is working together. So, how far do you feel Bitcoin and blockchain? I mean, as you mentioned, like Satoshi Nakamoto announced Bitcoin blockchain in the Peer-to-Peer Foundation newsletter. How far on the forum? How far do you think you influence or Bitcoin is influenced by the peer-to-peer philosophy? I mean, the fact that it's announced there kind of says to me that there's a lot of influence.
Um, yeah, well, I think, most of it for me is still an exit play, most of it, but I understand why that's the case. I think it's very rational to start thinking about exit plays,
So
because
that's your
things are
major
not doing
concern.
well.
That's your major concern, because that's the other part of the question is what do you think? Where are your concerns still? You're still skeptical of blockchain, right? You don't just think it's this.
Yeah,
You're
but
not
I'm
putting all
I'm
your money on
so
that horse.
I think within that you have the regions, right? The region versus degen. So obviously I have sympathy for the regions. You have Crypto Commons Alliance, you have so I'm basically for that connection between the blockchain, Bitcoin, crypto with a desire to solve these issues that we have today. And I think some of them are doing it, but nearly not enough. So I think this is where we are. It's just a reality. Um, but it's going to be key to have a successful transition is going to be that alliance between people regenerating locally, because you can only regenerate locally. It's a law of nature, right? Thermodynamics is if you create order in one place, you create disorder outside, right? Through the waste. So a healing can only happen locally, but it has to happen multi-locally in many places in the world at the same time. And in order to succeed, that means it also needs to be planetary and it needs capital. So I think in terms of entangled ownership, right? Can we have, for example, so now we have bioregional financing. It already exists. There's a bioregional financing handbook and stuff, right? So, and there's already bioregional drip funds. All these things exist for bioregional development. And bioregional development makes sense because the nation state is not ecological. And we need to know and manage our environmental resources. And the cosmolocal is so all the people doing regeneration locally are in solidarity with each other, doing different things, but all have the same goal of regeneration. And cosmolocal means all the people doing the same thing in the whole world are learning from each other, right? And so the idea is to have capital so that local commons can have stronger commons infrastructure, but also they can get global money, right? And so and you have this entanglement between the local and the cosmic, um, and so you can have very flexible tokenized fractal forms of ownership. And I don't know if you know Materium and stuff like that, so I'm looking at those types of solutions so that we can have these kind of flows. For example, community land trusts, right? If you want more healthy organic food, you need land, but land is too expensive. So you need to buy land and take it out of the speculative market and protect its value. So you need community land trust. That requires substantial investment. So where's that money coming from? Well, there's $3 trillion floating out there. Let's tap it,
There's also the inequality of early adopters. So there's so many people that invested in Bitcoin because of the gathering online exchange, right? Like kids who just played games. Are they going to
Yeah.
become the old money in the future, the new old money, or do you think there's some solution that's going to present itself? Is it just inevitable that we have the extremely wealthy and the extremely poor, even in this new system?
No, I think it's a question of balance, right? You want to have the system where there's enough individual initiative and where people can be rewarded if they're good at things, and so I think there has to be that has to exist, but you can't do it so much that there's nothing left, for the people at the bottom, right? Because they also need to live and to eat and to have interesting lives. So it's always going to be some kind of a balance. I just think personally that under the neoliberal regime, that balance has been lost. So, I think we need some degree of mutualization again. Um, and the thing is that we don't have to do it necessarily with the state. I think that's the good news, right? Is that we now have extraordinary capacity to self-organize, to self-fund, to learn collectively, where actually the state institutions are not as vital as they used to be. But we might have to invent new types of institutions.
Right. I
I'm
mean, because
thinking
you're
of
go
yeah.
ahead, sorry. Well, I was gonna say
No, I'm
corporatism is
thinking
is an
in a
issue.
cosmological, domain-specific institutions.
But so guild
Yeah.
law became corporatism, and I think at some point during after you mentioned the Benedictines and the monastic intelligentsia creating sustainable food supply, we ended up with Masonic guild law, and there's a huge benefit and flexibility and plasticity to guild law, but it still ends up with, by the 20th century, corporatism and fascist corporatism, especially. So I
Yeah.
wonder what you think is the difference between open cooperatives and these traditional cooperatives. What's the difference that makes them
Yeah.
better in the
Well,
future?
there's another interesting guy that I briefly want to mention, Carol Quigley, who
Hmm.
wrote a book called The Evolution of Civilization. It's a really probably the best single volume book about the history of civilization.
Rhodes Scholar
And
Carol Quigley.
he talks about instruments of expansion as being vital for civilization. So in order to have a civilization, it's surplus. Invested surplus. And this is done through instruments of expansion. The problem though is that they over time get corrupted. So for example, take feudalism, right? So one of the reasons that Rome lost is that it didn't have cavalry, and the Germanic warriors were very, very good with cavalry, and they just could, go through the legions and win over them. So feudalism is essentially a system where 100 farmers are needed to sustain a knight, right?
Hmm.
So at the time when it's invented, Europe is being invaded by the Vikings all the way to Paris, even in the south of Europe, by the Avars who come from the east, and what else? And the Muslims who come from the south, also to up to Poitiers in France. And in 300 years, feudalism succeeds in becoming an instrument of expansion that not only successfully defends Europe, but goes out to the Middle East and starts conquering itself, right? But
Yeah,
eventually it
in
becomes
Africa.
chivalry. They do games, they become corrupt, right? So then you get merchant capitalism, and the cities in Ghent and Bruges and Italy, and it's amazing, and they grow, but they eventually become mercantilist and they get corrupted. And the same with the nation state. So there is no formula forever, right?
Mercantilism was pretty cool in Holland for a minute, though, right? I mean,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
even you talked about Quigley. Quigley's entire play was to correct what Milner and Rhodes were doing wrong in Africa, right? And it seems kind of actually a good parallel that Africa was in a state of collapse and it didn't seem sustainable. And Cecil Rhodes thought, well, we can build resource-bound Max Weberian nation states, right? These nations are migratory. These states are resource-bound economies that can extract they can extract resources have a monopoly of violence. How do you see Quigley's evolution of the Rhodesian state system as some sort of alternative? Do you see it as a better system or some sort of a solution in itself?
I think that's in another book that is called The Anglo-American Establishment, and I didn't read that one, so I'm not sure what he says about that. But I think basically what he says is, Europe had three different systems of expansion, and they each got corrupted. And so the question that he had was, what's next? Can we reinvent a new instrument of expansion? He didn't have an answer to that, and that was in the 50s, and yeah, I think we can't, basically. I think it's it's the BRICS are going
That's
to
the thing,
be
right? Because
just
every experiment after the 50s. So you have, I mean, these are like the Rhodes Scholars, right? You've got like Clintonian neoliberalism and neoconservatism. Those are the two experiments that play out.
they're all extractive, hyper extractive, and they don't produce real value. That's the problem, right? So, for example, you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and the West was saying, "Oh, we're going to do some sanctions, and in 2 years they're going to collapse because they're only 3% of they're like Spain." And no, because Russia, it's 100% material, and if you look at Spain, it's 70% immaterial. It's wind, it's IP. And so that's the problem with the West, is like we are very strong monetarily if we count the money, but we can't produce anymore. We can't. I mean, we could eventually, with the industrial policy, and I think that's why I think we should go to distributed manufacturing, to a totally new model. Not like Trump, who thinks he can just reindustrialize the US. I think there's huge problems with that. Who knows, but we'll see. But I think we should be looking at a totally new model. And there, I think Europe has some advantages. We have high quality of life. We have a relatively clean environment. We have still a very highly educated population. I think we could do, but the difference is we have to do production. We have to make things. And that's why China is so strong. China makes things, right? So if you make things, you can have surplus, and then you can spread the surplus. We have become rentiers in the West. We're just a rentier system. We make money with debt, basically. We lend money, and then through the IMF, and we do IP. So they pay us when they play music, but we don't make and sell stuff, and so that's unsustainable.
Do you see distribution of do you imagine a world where the same products are manufactured in multiple continents, or that we return to a cappuccino economy? Which one's more practical? Where we
I
trade.
think to a large degree we will have to. So I'm thinking, for example, of projects that didn't work but was really interesting, and I think eventually will work. So it's called Arrival. Wasn't open source, but they had 2,000 engineers. They had simplified car making from 750 to like 50 processes. Made a physical platform, and they were going to do vans and buses for municipalities. Okay, it didn't work out financially, but that model for me, biocircular materials, locally sourced as much as you can. But it's not a question, we can't do everything, right?
Right.
We can't do everything. But, subsidiarity, the subsidiarity of material production, the lower possible level that is realistic, not for everything, but for many things. So we have to de-risk our supply chains. It's already happening. The question is at what level. So there's continental, there's nation state, there's bioregional. So we can de-risk and relocalize at different levels. But I
But
think that a lot of even nation states are looking at that actually right now.
even if we continentally segregate and have the more sustainable a continent is, the less incentive there is for trade, the less demand there is for trade. Is that wrong? I mean,
No, I think that's true, and I think at this stage in history, it's going to be more healthy to have less trade than more trade.
do you
This
see it as
is where we're going.
is it because of I mean, because is there a lack, is it an efficiency and a lack of entropy and competition, or is it just that being sustainable means
It's
there's
too
less risk
expensive.
and we have to be
It's
concerned with this?
thermodynamic. So once I have these statistics in my wiki. So once we spend 2 to 3 times more on transport than on making,
Mhm.
we have an issue. We have a
Well, then we've reached a
thermodynamic issue.
service. It's a service economy. Then the money is actually in the economy itself. The labor. It's
Yeah.
back. It's back to Marx. It's the labor itself that's valuable,
Well,
not the
I
resource.
still believe in that. I still ultimately value comes from labor,
Hmm.
right? Because if it's just in the ground, it has no value. And of course, the machine can take it out, but the machine has been conceived and made by people.
Hmm.
And free
For now,
software.
AI is the
Think
next
about
question.
you know, think about free software in AI in terms of labor theory value, right? It's basically they have reduced labor to a minimum, and then they can copy it, infinitely. That's why they can make so much money in the first phase, but also because they are demonetizing our economy.
Hmm.
There is a value crisis that is not understood,
Totally.
which is we make more and more things automated. We need less and less people. We have more and more contributory, and platforms where people work for free, and we pay less and less for it. That's that we are in a crisis mode. It's not working, and so something is going to give. And I think a contributory economy is an economy where we solve the problem of capitalism, which is not recognizing externalities. So I see a quadrant of social, ecological, positive and negative contributions, and that we have accounting systems which reflect that. And so we have and every civilizational revolution is a value revolution, right? So think about the Romans. Work is for the slaves. To be a free person, you can't work. You have to devote yourself to philosophy. When the Christians come, it's ora et labora, work and pray, matter and spirit on the same level. Work becomes salvific. Through my work, I make the work a better place. And a monastery, is a little paradise on earth where we create beauty and flowers and and nice buildings and art, right?
Back to
So this
Benedictines.
is
Yeah.
a totally different vision of labor, which was destroyed in the 15th century with the Reformation, which commodifies labor again, right? That's capitalism. But in between the 5th and the 15th century, we have a system where it actually works on contributions, and spiritual contributions and stuff like that. But anyway,
No,
so
I mean
I
that's
think
important.
we're going to go back to that different polarity eventually.
Isn't it maybe the service economy leading towards that? I mean, if Facebook and if Amazon's a better example is using electric solar powered trucks. I know Tesla has for the last 4 years at least been completely on sustainable energy for all of their charging stations. It's almost all from like wind and everything else. We could reach a point where the continental trade systems are using sailboats, right? With AI and everything else, we can reduce the amount of manual labor for the markets and for
Yeah, but
the
I think the
we
problem
were
is
to
in
sustain.
the problem. I don't think the problem is in the technology. The problem is in the incentives that
Hmm.
are behind the technology. And if you have private AI and the profit mode is then everybody will lose their jobs,
Hmm.
and it will be bad. The technology is not bad, but the way it's embedded in our society will have many negative effects. But if we have data co-ops and data commons, and data trusts. And we can spread the benefits more evenly because we actually produce them. Then people will have incomes to invest in their own projects, right? So I think it's not a question of the technology, it's the question of like what's the incentive behind its production and what it is used for. I think a lot of what we see as the negative side of technology, like if you look back in the early 90s, we didn't have all these bad stuff online.
Right. And we had all the same stuff. I swear to God, like there's not a new thing.
Yeah.
There's no new thing under the sun.
We had Usenet,
Oh
and
God.
I'm not saying there were no problems, but in general, it was much more healthy atmosphere and healthy social logic than once it was taken over by privates, because they incentivize you for all kinds of antisocial behavior.
Yeah,
That's how they make money.
Capitalism relies on consumerism, which both are inherently unstable, because if they can't make a profit, then there's no incentive to sustain the service. So how do you see, maybe a peer-to-peer solution for sustaining the technology? Is there a way that we can?
Think we
Are
have
we
to
going to go back to the Dark Ages?
I have to think. There's a good way and a bad way of looking at this. So in the beginning, when a system disintegrates, you have fragmentation and polarization, and you have exit, right? The first wave of exit are people with anticipatory consciousness. They see earlier than others that the system is no longer working. They leave the system to find solutions outside of the system. The early monks who leave the cities anyway. But then, once the cities start collapsing at the end of Rome, people have to leave the city, and where do they go? Well, they go where there are monasteries because it's safe, and they know how to make food there, right? So you have to see it in that way. So first,
this is happening today.
From bottom up, seed farms interconnecting with each other, creating translocal cooperation.
This is already, if you go to Alaska or something, there's a gas station where someone's getting paid $50 an hour just because they need someone at that gas station in the middle of nowhere, just for trade, right? This is already back to that.
Right.
An undervalued job becomes an essential work.
There's in the US, they have these 8 million disappearing workers. I don't know if you have seen anything about that. These are people that lost their job during COVID and they never came back. And nobody knows where they are. But if you travel a bit, 2 hours north of New York City or Asheville, North Carolina, or Mount Shasta, you find them. They're there. They just left the system already. And
Ayn Rand, where is John Galt, right?
In France, for example, which I know pretty well because I have 2 kids there, there is a huge wave of neo-ruralization going on in France. Huge wave. It started even before COVID. It's already, it was ongoing for 10 years, where, cities like Paris have lost like 300,000 people. And same San Francisco, New York. And, some of these people go to Florida because they're red state. But a lot of them go back to smaller cities, rural areas, and they won't be as rich materially, but maybe they'll have, satisfying lives with new friendships. And, that's what I have. When I'm in Chiang Mai, I have my wife's extended family. Her mother had 11 brothers and sisters who have 3 or 4 children, who have 1 or 2 children. My neighbors are my wife's family. And I had 2 kids in Belgium and 2 kids in Thailand. And in Belgium, even with the welfare state, it was very difficult when, when they're sick, and it's always, everything is complicated. And here in Thailand, it was a breeze because everybody was helping out in the family and we didn't have to worry about anything. We lost that in Europe, and that's the strength of many countries in the global south, is they still have the old form of tribalism.
So in terms of also labor, I think something, I don't know if Marx really predicted data as a value, the amount of data so many of these free services scraping the data of people. Do you see data play into this? Are we getting to a point where we know enough or we know everything and then the value is being superseded, or is data as important and as valuable as labor?
Yeah, so abstraction, right? Abstraction in general is powerful because the more you go up in the layers of the system, the more you can change, right? So if you're only concrete, you can only change your concrete situation. But if you're at the level of the operating systems with data, you can. And so I think basically we will need AI to have a thermodynamic, stable economy,
Mhm.
right? So we will need to manage our resources. We need to make agreements, otherwise we will go to war. Probably we'll have agreements after we go to war, but that's another story. And so we will be able to use uh, data for a resource-based economy. That's the way I see that in the future. Uh, and but the thing is, we have to reappropriate the technology, and I think right now we're in a very bad path because AI. I use AI, but you know, so McLuhan said every technology is a handicap of your body. It weakens the individual and strengthens the collective. So calculating a machine, we can no longer count. A car, it's like cutting your legs. And AI is the worst because it's cutting your brain. And I can already see it on my Twitter feed. I see people, asking AI this and then another AI whether that AI was okay.
Hmm.
And they've already studies now where they show that the neurons actually diminish.
Lobotomization,
So
yes.
yeah, kind of lobotomization, and so I think if you're smart, it's not a problem because you'll use it in a smart way. But if you're not smart and you try to compensate your lack of smartness with AI, you're on a very dangerous path. And IQ is going down, education levels are going down in the West, and AI is not going to solve any of these issues.
Chris
So
says people have been getting
I'm not.
stupider his entire life.
Um, yeah, I think there is serious concern about it, and one of the reasons I'm reading more is because I saw it happening to myself, and I don't open my computer before 1 p.m. Like just I don't. I read, I think, I write, I because I know that it does something to my brain which is not healthy.
It's a
So
good answer.
I'm not necessarily optimistic. I think it will get worse before it gets better, but I think that your capacity to project yourself in the future is very important, right? So you have two forms of transcendence. And there's Viktor Frankl who wrote a book, Man in Search of Meaning. He said there's only two kinds of people who survived in the concentration camps, the Catholics and the communists. The Catholics, because they have vertical transcendence, they could connect with the life of the spirit and then, see good even though everything around them physically was bad. And the communists, they had horizontal transcendence, right? They could project themselves in the future because they believed in an utopian future. And so that's why I'm doing my work on macro historians, on cycles, because it's like if you're the caterpillar, even your brain will become mush,
Hmm.
The butterfly has a different brain than the caterpillar. But if you can identify with a butterfly to come, right, then because we need narratives. We need narratives. We need individually and collectively, we need narratives. If you're neurotic or psychotic, you have actually a narrative breakdown. And that happens to society. Civilizational breakdowns are narrative breakdowns. So it's very important. I'm not saying I have the right way, but that's what I'm trying to do is like, what is there any narrative around social change that can mobilize
Well,
people to survive the transition times, basically.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It seems like with capitalism, you have the issue of commodification of labor and services, and that can be incentivizing, but it can also decentivize, and just it's very, like we said, it's unstable. With a state control, you might have a sustainable form of Marxist labors and services. Labors and services can be enforced by a state control, but it seems like you're kind of arguing for neither. You've got something in between or different.
Yeah, it's the commons, not the state, not the market. So I think
Right.
nation states or public authorities, will exist because we always have collective territory
Mhm.
where we need to live together with different people and make agreements and create institutions for that. And we'll have markets for scarce goods that that we need to know how valuable they are. But I think they need to be embedded by common good institutions which can protect the collective survival
Yeah.
of the
So
planet.
how do you visualize that? Like, how does a commons-based economy avoid
Yeah,
commodification
I'll
and
give you an example.
centralization?
And yeah, I'll give you an example. And if you don't mind, we can maybe wrap it up because
Yeah, we're
my
nearly at the end.
my
Sorry.
throat is becoming. Uh, so
Thank you
yeah,
for
so
answering all these questions. It's basically a semester's worth of political science right here, everybody.
At least. At least.
so so there's a project I really like. It's called Global Thresholds and Allocations. It's done by something called r3o.org. And so what they propose is this. So we have a council of scientists that monitors the global thresholds and allocations for 130 commodities. You know the Mendeleev scale, right? Yeah, you found it. And basically, copper. There's so much copper in the world. We find new copper on average so much every year. The productivity of copper increases so much percent every year on average. The biocirculation of copper is 70%. So if you use copper, you only get 70% for the next iteration, etc., right? And they determine negative pivots. And so if you're under that level of copper, then people start stealing copper in the railways and taking it out of the ground. So, okay, we need an agreement in the world between the nations, for example, to manage copper use within that limit. And you do that for different commodities, right? And then you have an accounting system which not only reflects financial value, but gives you the flows of matter and energy directly. So you can make decisions based on context-based sustainability. And so we will need institutions that monitor that. And that's what I call these commons institutions. So and I think they should not just be nation state institutions. They could be institutions that are multi-stakeholder, representation of the contributory communities, for example, the scientists and the people who use the resources and form like new forms of contributive democracy. So we need to invent these institutions. But I think things like DAOs, even though they don't really work that well yet, these are all like ways in which we're trying to find out new ways of managing these complex systems that are not pure markets, are not pure state, but they're meta. They integrate, but they embed it within a logic of the protection of the commons. Because markets and states are extractive, and the commons are the only historical regenerative institution that has worked for thousands of years to protect local communities and territories. The only thing is that we now have to do it at a global scale as well. And that's new. We don't know how to do it.
I desperately want to ask you, just lastly, if
Yeah,
there's anything.
go ahead. One more question.
Last thing, and I don't. It sounds like you don't. You're humble about this. You got a lot of information, but you're not pretending to have all the answers. But what's something you would say we can all do to start moving in the directions of the cosmo-localist commons? How can we, as individuals, maybe like move towards this goal?
Well, I would do one local thing and one cosmic thing, I would do what I
Nice.
would join I would join something local. Whether it's permaculture, organic food collective, or whatever it is, mutual aid, something that connects you to local people. I think that's important for your mental health. Because as the state weakens, you have to really start thinking, who will help me? And it's not obvious. Families, yes, families are very good, but do we still have families in the West? Not so much, right?
Mormons, yeah,
So
but otherwise.
that means we have to create new types of families, neo-tribal arrangements where you can trust people. And when I was cancelled, I learned this, right? I was more in the commons, but the commons is non-reciprocal. It's you serve a collective, and then you make the collective stronger. But actually, almost nobody of my friends on the left came to my rescue. And I realized that I had given, years of my life and loads of money, and nothing came back when I needed
Right.
it, right? That was a life lesson. And I said, from now on, I want reciprocity. I want to be surrounded by people I can trust, that have my back, and I know that I'm a good person, and if something happens to me, they can they can help me, right? And I think as the world becomes more unstable, more and more people will discover they need to do this. So that's a local thing. And then I think the other thing is you should what kind of knowledge can you contribute to? What kind of collective knowledge can you contribute to? And just try to have these two things in your life. Nobody has a solution for everything, but if we all do our the ikigai, right? The Japanese system where so what am I good for? What do I like to do? What is needed, and what are people willing to pay for? Right? If you want to make a living and be happy, you need at least all four, right? There's more than four, but that's like the simple. By the way, I like what you're doing there. There's the kind of VJing, stuff while
I
I'm
would
talking. Great.
I'm only a VJ because of Belgians. It's actually a funny fact. If it weren't for the Belgian Archaeos VJ software, then I wouldn't know anything about
Oh, wow.
VJing.
Okay.
Yeah, Belgians saved my
Yeah.
life. Shout out to all the
But I want to tell
Walloons out
you,
there.
Belgium is interesting because it was historically a land of missionaries. You know, like you go to Indonesia or the Philippines, you'll discover that there's like 10,000 Salesians there, teachers, and like a third of them are from Belgium. You know,
Interesting
it's
point.
it's 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 less now because there's not so many people are becoming religious professionals.
So,
But
in the most positive way, you are in line with the tradition.
yes, yeah,
I'm a
Belgian
monastic
abroad.
VJ. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
to
like
be honest, if you believe in past lives, I'm pretty sure I was a monk at some point. You know.
I think the best of us, unless we were crickets, the best of us were monks. That's like it had to have been
Yeah.
if you were surviving. I like what you're saying about connecting the two, the macrocosmic and the microcosm, the local and the cosmopolitan, the global. I think you can't just have one solution. You have to do two things in parallel. That's pretty cool. Eugenie says, why can't all boomers be like this? This guy is based. Yeah. Well, we really appreciate that you came and you make the time to talk with us. I definitely hope that we get
Yeah,
to do
it
this
was a
again.
pleasure, man. And I also feel I can talk like 100% open with you guys.
I appreciate
Uh,
that. We have to meet in the
yeah.
future, either here or that on either side of the pond. We'll meet in real life, I'm sure.
Yeah, well,
You're an important
anybody
person.
who's traveling to Thailand, to Chiang Mai, let me know. I'd be happy to meet up with you and have a conversation. And yeah, we can always do another conversation about the weird stuff another time.
Perfect. Well,
Um,
can I also give
I
them a
actually
link
wrote
to
an
follow you too? Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I actually wrote an autobiography because I'm getting old and people start doing that. and my experiences with Rosicrucians and Templars and Rajneesh. I have lots of savvy anecdotes about these experiences.
Let me just tell people that they want to find your Substack. It does exist. Fourth Generation Civilization. Substack is pretty cool, and you've got some interesting articles here. I hope everyone takes the time to subscribe and to check these out. This is also an incredible collection of both intellectual information and your personal life. So if you like this guy, definitely follow his Substack. And as you know, the PTP Foundation, Peer-to-Peer Foundation Wiki, as he said, this is where Bitcoin was announced, and you're going to want to know, you're going to want to keep your eye on this one if you want to be in the same pool as some interesting folk. Thanks a lot for being here. Is there anything else you want to make sure that we share?
No, I'm good. I thank you for your interest and for the stimulating prompts. And I actually, I have met Raphael in the past, but I didn't know about you guys' podcast, so I'll have to take a look. And so I'm also Bauwens on Twitter, on X, and I do curation there. I'm shadow banned. I used to have 20,000 people. I'm now struggling to get more than 500, but anyway.
This is where it comes back to the localized mutualization, however you would call it. We all need to stick together in a sense, especially if we want to do something honest and something beneficial. Maybe, it puts all us individuals in a sense closer together as well, hopefully in a good sense, if the overlords are not supportive.
One of the first hackers ever
the
arrested.
Gnostic Brotherhood, man. It's the Gnostic Brotherhood. It exists. You just recognize people. Yeah.
What
I think very important. Very important is to do at least some self work. That because the biggest danger for human beings is projection, right? Things that you don't accept in yourself, and you project them to evil outsiders, and that's how we do a lot of harm in the world. So if we need to work on ourselves, as we need also try to make the world a better place at the same time.
I just wanted to say Stellium 7, who's Michael Prince Wilkerson, one of the first, I think the first hacker arrested in the United States as a teenage boy, is watching as well. So the kind of people that we're surrounded with are some of the most interesting people, and I'm glad to tie us all together. So thank you all for being here. And thank you so much, Michel. We will definitely get, hey, Michael, Michel, part of the Mike Tinuum. Very good. We'll see you soon.
Yeah. It's all good. It's all good for me.
Right.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone in chat, and looking forward to the next time and to meet up again. Thank you very much, Michel.
Thank you, guys.
Andreas.
Thank you, guys.
Good viewer. Watch Xirtus.